Could I get your attention, please? Hello? If I could get everyone to take their seats, we'll commence our program. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Please join me in welcoming our webcast viewers. My name is Gillian Riley, and I'm the president of the Canadian Club of Toronto and your host for today. Viewers, Happy New Year and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Our club strives to offer you a diversity of speakers who address current issues. We are conscious of Canada's rich diversity and strive to reflect this, not only in the topics but in the speakers who present them. We are proud of our club's track record of providing a forum for decision makers, cultural icons, and thought leaders. Our annual economic and political forecast event is one of our most popular offerings throughout the year. Before I formally introduce our panelists, here is a snapshot of upcoming events which I hope you'll consider joining. On Wednesday, January 17th, we will address the issue of unconscious bias in leadership with a distinguished panel of experts. And on Monday, January 30th, President and CEO of BCE Inc. in Bell Canada, George Cope, will announce a new initiative that his company is taking to support their Bell Let's Talk program, championing mental health in the workplace. To learn more about the club or to order tickets, please visit our website at canadianclub.org. You can also join the conversation via Twitter and Instagram by following us at CDNCLUBTO or by using that hashtag. Allow me again to extend a special thanks to our event partner, the National Post. We are proud of and thankful for our ongoing collaboration and support. Today's event is also being made possible by our sponsor, E&Y, represented by Eric Rawlinson, and also by Scotiabank. Thank you for your generous support. I also finally want to acknowledge the youth and young leaders who are with us today from the York School and C.W. Jeffries Collegiate Institute, sponsored by Julie DiLorenzo. Please stand so we can acknowledge you. Thank you very much for joining us today. And now it's time to hear from our panelists about what lies in store for 2018. We have assembled some of Canada's most experienced and insightful journalists, columnists, and financial experts. How will the vulnerability of NAFTA talks affect markets? What should we expect from the upcoming provincial election? Will changes to labour laws negatively impact our economy? Let's find out from our expert panel. Club Vice President Bruce Sellery returns as moderator extraordinaire. You may know him as a personal finance expert and best-selling author. He is a columnist for Money Sense and appears regularly on CBC, Cityline, and Breakfast Television. Joining Bruce are Claudia Cattaneo. Claudia is the Western business columnist at the National Post, where she covers business and policy issues shaping the Western Canadian economy. Andrew Coyne, a National Post veteran. Andrew's journalism career has included positions with Maclean's, the Globe and Mail, and the Southern newspaper chain. Diane Francis. Diane is a well-known journalist, author of 10 books, and editor-at-large at the National Post. She has also been a columnist with the Financial Post since 1987. Amanda Lang. Amanda is an award-winning journalist who has been covering business in North America for 20 years. She's currently an anchor for BNN Bloomberg Television. J.F. Perrault has served as Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at Scotiabank for the past 2 years. He leads a team of economists who support the bank's domestic and international business lines. Members and guests, Please do not forget, if you have a question, please fill them out on the Q&A cards that have been provided at your tables, and our staff will collect them. Bruce and panelists, the Canadian Club podium is yours.
Thank you very much, Jilly, and hello, everyone. Welcome to those of you who have been with us in the past, and a new welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time today. How it goes is I ask our panelists for predictions of the year ahead. Some of them will skirt around such an emphatic point, Andrew Coyne in particular, but in any event, they will shed insight onto what they expect might unfold in 2018. And we begin on the backs of quite a stunning year. 2017 was quite a stunning year. And as always, in preparation for this event, I review the video of the event that we hosted last year. And sometimes there are these wild predictions that we revisit with amusement. This year, my net takeaway is that the predictions that our panelists spoke of last year were largely accurate, but the magnitude was vastly understated. So, Andrew, you said none of us can predict what Trump will do on any issue. Yeah, A+. Thank you all for coming. We'll see you next year, because Andrew's done. There we go. Diane, you said the biggest risk with Trump is Twitter. Accurate, but I would say, yes, accurate. But I would say understated, given that this is a president who tweets his threats to North Korea out in the middle of the night. So understated, perhaps. And Amanda, I'll finish with you. Of Trump's election, you said, there's a madman in the White House. So I will just leave that out there, but use that as a very logical segue to question number one, and it is this. Amanda Lang, Michael Wolff has released Fire and Fury, his book about his time connected to the White House experts, raising many new questions about Trump and his fitness for office. My question to you, will Donald Trump be president of the United States this time next year?
Wow.
So do you need a little tension track, like
I need a music soundtrack for this one. This is one of those predictions where what you desire and what you believe may conflict. I think he will be. But I think he will have a fight. I think there will be a real challenge to his presidency. Maybe not the 25th Amendment challenge that's being mooted, but I think his legitimacy will be questioned in a real way.
On what fronts do you think the fight will be most pronounced?
I think his fitness is actually a legitimate question, and I think the source of it is most likely to come from intelligence and military officials. Although so far they've sort of backed his, I don't know if you can call it policy, but they've backed him on how he's handling North Korea in a surprising way. But those are the areas I think he's weakest and most vulnerable to the fitness questions.
Andrew, last year you said, more serious than Twitter is the rule of law as a convention. We obey the law. My concern is that he's so unbound by norms of political or personal contact. At least Nixon was a crook when no one was looking, but he handed over the tapes. So when you think about that in the context of Trump and the unfolding Russia investigation, how would you update your thinking?
I think it's borne out again when you look at it's all become normalized, so we forget what's going on. But even the casual comments that he allows his people to make about Mueller, this is, a special counsel investigation. This is nothing to be trifled with. This is not politics as usual, and yet they treat it as such. When you look at some of the things he's been saying about basically ordering the Justice Department to investigate his previous rival, Hillary Clinton. When you look at, one of the things he's got that Nixon never had, as others have said, is he's got Fox News. He's got a 24-hour-a-day propaganda channel, muddying the waters on every issue, even on things of simple questions of fact. All that being said, Mueller is very dangerous to him. He's a serious person, and they've got lots of grounds to work with here when you look at the people they've indicted and the people they've been able to turn. But to come back to the question that Amanda was addressing, it's extremely difficult and should be extremely difficult to remove a president. It's very difficult constitutionally. The bar that you have to not just get the majority of the House, but you have to get 2/3 of the Senate to vote to convict. Americans have a horror of going down that road, and even if they didn't, politically, the planets have to align a certain way. The only way I can conceive of it happening is after the midterms if the Democrats control the Congress, and even then it'll have to, people will read the political cards as to is this to my advantage or not to go down this road. It'll be colored and informed by what Mueller reveals, but I would bet against him being removed certainly in the next year.
What about if he leaves himself? If he just decides he's bored?
It's conceivable. Again, he's outside all previous norms. His health is also not great. And the only other point I'd make is, as hard as it is to impeach somebody, it's, I would say, even harder to invoke the 25th Amendment, which is the one, if you're not familiar, to do with the incapacity of a president. And again, the bar should be high. I mean, people have had this debate about is he, what's his mental capacity, but I think
He's like really smart.
Exactly. He's a very stable genius, etc. But I think the point has been well made that if you're going to seriously try to go down the 25th Amendment road, the guy's got to be absolutely psychotic, and I don't think he's that.
Diane, Oprah Winfrey made quite a splash at the Golden Globes. She spoke eloquently and has not gone the distance to dissuade anyone from believing she might run in 2020. Your prediction on whether she will communicate an intention or not to run for president in 2018?
Well, not just her specifically, but I think that we have a new norm in terms of the political process in the U.S. Running for president's always sort of been a political version of American Idol and has very little to do with policy and a lot to do with looks and appearance and TV performance. Now it's really quite obvious that you have to be a celebrity. You have to have the greatest asset any politician can have is fame, and she can stand toe-to-toe with him. So could George Clooney. So could Speyer. So could a lot of Mark Cuban. So could a lot of the people in the United States who are, wading kind of into the political fray. And I think the Democrats are going to have to get a celebrity. So if it's Oprah, fine. If it's George Clooney, fine. If it's Mark Cuban, who sort of says he's a Republican, but he can go either way, a very credible guy. But you have to have somebody famous.
Amanda?
Well, I mean, I find it all really disheartening. And I found this in the last in the presidential election. This is arguably, if not the most important job in the world, it's top 3 for all of us. This matters, and the process matters, and it's just disheartening the candidates that they're fielding. I felt disheartened that there weren't better candidates on both sides of the race last time. George Clooney, God help us. I mean, this is an important job. I love him, by the way. Don't tell him I said anything bad. But we really do need a rejuvenation of why you run and what it means and what it's for. We got it right in this country. We generally do. They really need to give their heads a shake in the States.
Andrew?
I wonder if there'll be a backlash, though, having seen the results of a rank amateur in power. That surely has to give some people pause, whether they want to go down that road again. The other thing is, celebrity isn't enough. You've also got to be good at the political game. And Trump, give him his due, has a particular talent, and the talent may simply be shamelessness, but not everybody could have done what he did to win that election. So, yeah, celebrity is a factor, but lots of people who have great name recognition, great celebrity, fizzle out of politics.
JF, we're going to talk in more detail about your economic predictions, but I want to ask you how you listen to and engage with all this noise in the U.S. and determine what's relevant in your role and what is interesting to read and talk about around the water cooler, but is salacious and nothing else. With examples, please.
With examples. God, there's 5 a day. The thing... when you go back to this time last year and the conversation we had then and what's happened over the last year is, when you take a step back and you think about it from people's well-being perspective, an economic perspective, a financial perspective, all of the things that Trump has said and all the things that we worry about have to a certain degree been a distraction. And that's kind of the really surprising thing to me about all of this is that even though, we worry about, I read it, I see his tweets 100 times a day, whatever it is, read about everything that people say about him, and it's easy to worry. It's easy to think, oh my God, there's going to be a war in Korea. There's going to be, NAFTA's going to get ripped up. Corporate tax reform is going to be terrible for Canada. A whole bunch of things that, on the face of it, are really worrisome. But in reality, as we've experienced over the last year, and whether it's because he bluffs or whether it's because his words have less meaning or less consequence than we think, but over the course of last year, we realized that, geez, a lot of this really isn't impacting us to the extent that we thought we would. Because we had a fantastic year.
You know, you sound kind of like a hash brownie.
Like a what?
Like a hash brownie, like a I don't know,
like a potato?
Cannabis.
Oh.
It's very relaxing. Don't worry, be happy. It's going to be legalized in this country. Don't you feel like you can smell it in the air? JF is like kind of, I'm not saying you're smoking something. I'm smelling your view.
You're just smelling it.
Yeah, I'm smelling it somewhere. Andrew, I want to ask you to pick up on the thread of the midterms and your thought on whether the balance will tilt 10 months from now.
Well, as you know, Bruce, I don't make predictions, but
thanks for letting me know.
If you look at what they call the generic polling number in the states, which is you look at the party affiliation number rather than what would you vote in your particular district, it's very bad for the Republicans right now. Trump is himself down in the mid-30s in the approval ratings, so he's not particularly an asset for them at this point. But there's still 10 months to go before the midterm, so it's hard to read. But if they had it today, you could see certainly in the Senate and maybe even the House of Representatives going to the Democrats, which would be extraordinary, having controlled both houses until now to lose them both.
Can you give some examples of what might change? Would change Trump's Twitter habits?
A war with North Korea. I mean, there's so many imponderables. Even on the economy, we're now reaching capacity constraints across North America. Funny things start to happen at that point. The kind of steady glide path that we've been on for a long time. This is the kind of year where it could get disrupted. We just don't know. But I'm just saying. There's an old saying: a week is a long time in politics. 10 months is an eternity.
Claudia, I want to bring in the view from the West. You are from the West. You're based in the West. You cover the West. Keystone XL was approved. That was a big change. It happened almost immediately. It received regulatory approval in Nebraska just back in November. What are you looking at for 2018 from that perspective, from the West and from pipelines in particular?
Okay, well, Keystone XL, one good thing that Trump did, it was kind of downhill from there. As you know, the future of Keystone XL is still uncertain because even though we had a positive decision in Nebraska, the commission that gave it decided that the route was going to be a little bit different. So I think Keystone will go ahead, but it's going to be a fight every step of the way. There's still a lot of opposition, and people will use that. But if it does go ahead, it will be a big lift, actually, for the Western Canadian economy. I think it will bring investment back, confidence back for sure. And it would also be a win politically for governments, Trudeau government, the Notley government, and give something in return for the very heavy price that Alberta has been paying in order to get these pipelines approved.
Diane, on the NAFTA file, we have seen many conversations, many photo ops, many meetings, some of it public, some of it certainly behind the scenes. What do you expect will happen on that story in 2018?
Well, I think it's pretty predictable because he's a protectionist. And this is why I've been arguing that, and I did actually argue years ago, that, we shouldn't be allying ourselves with Mexico. We have a wonderful, fair, harmonious relationship with the United States on trade. And since NAFTA's happened, both of the two countries have done very well, and we basically have a tiny surplus. They have a tiny surplus over us. I mean, it's just perfect. The strategy in Ottawa to side with Mexico, in other words, they're big, there has to be 2 against 1, is beyond foolish. It's actually dangerous. Mexico's benefited enormously. Mexico has disappointed the NAFTA partners hugely because their labor rates, instead of going up, which was the hope that it would be bootstrapped by the NAFTA deal, and which is why the Americans convinced us to let them join our deal, the two-way deal, has actually not occurred. And their wages are 1/20th what our wages are, and they were a lot higher before. It's deteriorated socially, politically. Their institutions are weak, and their combined trade deficits with Canada and the U.S. are really quite horrible, quite hideous, $50 billion a year. So I would say, I wouldn't go so far as to say throw Mexico under the bus, but I think Canada should not be their ally. I think we should talk to the U.S. on their own merits. And don't forget, he's going to be tough on NAFTA, particularly Mexico. I mean, NAFTA means Mexico, not Canada and the U.S. to voters. But he's going to be very tough. Why? Because there are 10 Democratic Senate re-elections up in states that voted for him. And so he's going to be targeting those states that have suffered the most because of Mexico and NAFTA to get a turnover, a conversion in the midterms, or to stop the damage. So he's going to be tough, and I think Canada should say, okay, let's do a separate deal.
Andrew, your view on NAFTA and Chrystia Freeland's role, and she was relatively new into it last time. You were fairly optimistic about the impact she might be able to have. How has she measured up, and what's next?
Well, she was clearly a better choice than Stéphane Dion, who has many talents, but diplomatic skills is not one of them, perhaps. And she knows the states and knows the power structures in the states as good as anybody in that government. But it's obviously this is a much larger issue than just the capabilities of one foreign affairs minister. I'm not as clear as Diane that we want to throw the Mexicans on the bus. I think there is some merit to the idea of strength in numbers. We should be clear, certainly, that the size of the trade deficit or surplus is irrelevant as a matter of economics. It may be relevant as a matter of politics because Trump himself is obsessed with it. I think he sees it as a sort of a national profit and loss statement, which it isn't. And so it must be very confounding to everybody at that negotiating table. All governments are a little bit protectionist, even when they're negotiating free trade treaties, because they want to protect their sensitive sectors. The Trump government is out-and-out protectionist. As I say, they're obsessed with the trade deficit. The demands that they brought to the table, whether it's the 5-year sunset clause or we've got to have a clause in there about reducing the trade deficit, or at some point they talked about maybe we should have some sort of floor on the Canadian dollar so we couldn't do something tricky with the Canadian dollar. The demands of that table are unlike anything anybody's ever brought to a negotiating table that I can ever recall. To be fair, our own government has brought some pretty loopy demands to the table as well. On the social side, including demanding somehow that the 28 U.S. states with right-to-work laws somehow have to get rid of them. So there's a lot of grandstanding and showboating, I think. I think some people are anticipating these talks to fail, and they may well be right. What gives me some reason for optimism or hope anyway is I think it's extremely difficult for the U.S. president to get out of NAFTA. He can give notice, he can sign papers, but ultimately the enabling legislation has to be passed by the Congress as a matter of constitutional separation of powers, and it's extremely unclear to me that he could get the votes in Congress, certainly to cut off trade with Canada or to close off the trade deal with Canada. So I think presumably the battle will shift there sometime this year.
Amanda, what you want to?
Well, the only thing I would add is trade protectionism globally was a preoccupying theme at Jackson Hole recently with central bank heads and economists. It's a concern for everybody globally. It's not a uniquely North American phenomenon. But what economists who are there say most people agreed is that the administration officials doing the negotiating on the U.S. side are top-notch free traders, believe in perhaps not all of the details of this deal, but believe in a deal. So the kind of rhetoric that we get from the West Wing is less relevant than what's actually happening in that room. Could he throw it off? Presumably. But the people who are actually doing the deal, it should reassure us that there are some kind of sober minds at that table and kind of pushing in the same direction.
JF, when you read the forecasts from all of the banks over the course of the last 12 months or so, NAFTA has been flagged as a risk factor. Is that a bigger risk, a smaller risk than you might have articulated 6 months ago? And what is the risk in particular, in your view?
Well, to some extent, whether or not the risk materializes, we're suffering the consequences of there simply being a risk, which is uncertainty. Right? So, I mean, we're not sure if we're going to be in NAFTA a year from now, 2 years from now. We're not sure who's going to be in NAFTA a year or two from now, if in fact that we get a deal with the Americans that exclude the Mexicans. But the reality is all this toing and froing about the state of negotiations, whether or not he's going to rip it up, whether or not he's got the power to rip it up or to pull the U.S. out, leads to some degree of uncertainty on the part of firms, and that's having an impact on activity. Now, it's hard to tell because things are going really, really well in Canada. We'd only have to conjecture things would be even better were there not to be any of this uncertainty. But really is a question of uncertainty at this point in time, because as we think about the economic consequences of withdrawal for Canada, you have to map out a range of scenarios, right? Whether it's just a Canada-U.S. deal that comes out of this, whether it's something that's more fundamental in terms of modifying the trading relationship. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is about 50% of the trade between Canada and the U.S. is done outside of the context of NAFTA. It's just kind of organic in that way. So the net impact of a withdrawal, I think, is reasonably manageable. The bigger concern that we have in terms of kind of big picture risk related to trade are more linked to trade protectionism in the extreme, which is to say that a lot of the things that Trump says he wants to achieve in the context of NAFTA can't simply be done by renegotiating NAFTA. They've got to go to a higher power, which is the World Trade Organization. And there, some of the changes that he would like, if we take him to his word, would like to implement are basically illegal from a global trading perspective. And that, were he to pursue that very aggressively, and that's a risk, I think that has the potential to be a far more consequence globally and from a Canadian perspective than probably at the end of the day tweaks around NAFTA.
Andrew.
Just to add to that, even if the worst happened, let's suppose Trump somehow gets, rips up NAFTA, and he imposes a 10% tariff across the board on Canadian imports. The first consequence of that is the Canadian dollar goes down and offsets some or all of that increase. So, we traded with the United States for 120 years without a free trade agreement. We could do so again. It wouldn't be optimal. Most of the dislocation would be sort of between sectors, because protectionism usually basically protects one sector against another rather than one country against another. So there'd be a lot of dislocation, but we would still continue to trade with them. And life would go on. It would be less than optimal.
Yeah, Diane?
Yeah, and just to add on that point briefly, we're really not an exporting nation, and the U.S. isn't either. Most of the trade, the $2 billion a day, is intercorporate transfers between branch plants and parent companies. And sometimes the parent companies are Canadian in the U.S. and they're transferring up here. So this is really a family affair. We have a long-standing relationship. The American percentage of ownership in our export industries is enormous. 100% of manufacturing, 50% of oil, 30% of mining, 80% of retail. I mean, they're not going to shoot themselves in the foot. And we have a very nice relationship, and nobody's controlling anybody else's lives. So I really think a two-way deal is important, and make a special place for Mexico.
Amanda, question from the floor. In spite of all the Trump rhetoric, how do you explain the level of U.S. business and consumer confidence and earnings and stock market levels?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you could reflect on that same question in a Canadian context, which is you can get a real sense of pessimism on Main Street that seems sort of divorced from what's happening for corporations, for government, you read the headlines on jobs and there's a bit of a disconnect in how people are feeling about their personal well-being and the underlying fundamentals. Here, I think a lot of it has to do with cost of living, indebtedness. I think people feel a concern about the kind of sustainability of how we're living personally. In the States, I just really do think that the vein that was tapped a year and a half ago of a sense of being left out of something is real. It's true. There was a great unleashing of wealth in the 1980s as we opened up capital markets, and many ordinary workers did not participate, and we have yet to find a way to really incorporate them back into this wealth story. So as the Dow hits new highs and corporate profit hit new highs and confidence surges and capacity is low and unemployment is at record lows, you still get this sense of disgruntlement out there, and that's a social problem, and it's one that requires social engineering from policy.
Claudia, you had a thought on NAFTA. I just don't want to skip over that.
I just wanted to observe that as far as Western Canada is concerned, it's almost thinking beyond NAFTA already. There's a sense that the natural resource economy, especially oil and gas, is just way too dependent on the U.S. market. And so that's why there's such a huge push to get to Asia, because certainly there's a big cost in being overly dependent on the U.S., and it's the fact that our resources are so heavily discounted because we have nowhere else to go.
We're going to come to Canada in a second, but JF, one last question before we do, and that is on the U.S. tax cut plan. So what prediction do you have on how that will affect their economy in reality, and where it puts us as a country in terms of our competitive position?
We're in line with just about, well, I was going to say something dangerous. I was going to say sensible, but we're in line with a lot of people, which is to say that the impact of the tax reform in the U.S. we don't anticipate is going to have a huge impact on activity. I mean, it's going to be positive. The tax cuts usually are. But, at this point in the cycle where things are going very, very well in the U.S. and the Fed's in the process of tightening interest rates, any additional stimulus you get on the fiscal side is going to be to some extent offset by the Fed. I think the bigger issue is, what this means for Canada. And again, we're, reasonably sanguine about that. Partly, if it's good for the U.S. in general, it's good for Canada. So there's that part to it. But the other dimension, which is really kind of hard for people to wrap their heads around, and even myself, and I'm sure a lot of folks in the audience, is corporate tax rates at the end of the day don't matter nearly as much as economic fundamentals. So that we may think that a large difference with respect to corporate tax rates in the U.S. to Canada, or the other way around as it's been for many years, would lead to a very significant advantage of one country over the other in terms of attracting investment. And that's, it's very, very hard to find that in the data. So that we may think this is kind of a catastrophic development for Canada, that U.S. corporate tax rates are at our level or slightly below, depends on how it gets rolled out. Same thing on the personal tax side. But the economic evidence, the kind of statistical evidence, empirical evidence, doesn't really lead us to be all that worried about what it means for Canada.
I want to shift our focus to the Canadian political situation. And Andrew, I'm going to begin with you. What do you expect from Justin Trudeau in 2018? What are the priorities? What are the potential missteps? What's behind your grin?
Well, I think one of the things he's going to have to be dealing with is this vexed balancing act that they've been trying to do on pipelines versus carbon pricing. And this issue bedevils all the parties in different ways. The NDP is divided over it, particularly between their Alberta wing and the rest of the party. The Conservatives are divided, at least again, between the federal and some of their provincial parties, but I think also to some extent at the federal level. The Liberals have been more or less united on this, but with this very tricky, as I say, balancing act of we're both for carbon pricing and for pipelines. And presumably Trans Mountain is going to come to a head sometime this year. And I think it's going to be a very interesting challenge for the government. It's one thing to say, well, we've approved it, applause, 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 but I think people realize approving something and getting it built is two different things. It is going to be, from all appearances, a knockdown, drag-out fight, and maybe even literally. I mean, there are people who are so convinced that this is the end of the planet that they're not going to be satisfied with fighting it every inch of the way in the courts or in public opinion, but they will be physically blockading it. The interesting question to me is, supposing that's the case, and supposing it becomes a really ugly fight, and supposing Trudeau sticks to his guns and gets the thing built, and the federal government will be inevitably implicated in this, does that cause people in Alberta and Saskatchewan to look at the Liberal Party differently than they have for 50 or 60 years? It's a really interesting potential opening for them. So I think that's going to be one of the major items on his agenda. Beyond that, the other, I guess, major thing that he's going to be tackling is he's got provincial elections in Quebec and Ontario, where if the elections were held today, you would say governments that are reasonably friendly to the federal Liberal government will be replaced by governments that will be less friendly, and that'll be a huge challenge for him as well.
Claudia, last year, one of the things that you put into the mix was the election in British Columbia and what might happen if the NDP were to be victorious. They were victorious.
That's right.
How did that change the game, and what's your thought in the context of the remarks Andrew has made?
Well, not only the NDP in BC win, but they have this partnership with the Green Party, which has meant a lot more hostility, I guess, toward pipelines. Alberta and BC are literally at war with each other, even though they both have NDP governments. So they will continue to oppose these projects. They're backing off a little bit on their opposition to LNG. But it's going to make things very difficult for the NDP in Alberta, for Notley, because if Trans Mountain doesn't go ahead, Kenny's going to get a lot of support. It's a very complicated political situation out there, and I think the game changer actually will be First Nations, because they're finally awakening to the fact that they're getting played by environmentalists, and they are becoming pro-energy projects. And I think we'll hear a lot from them this year.
Diane, one of the areas in which Trudeau and his government took some heat was on the small business tax changes. Will Bill Morneau be finance minister 12 months from now?
Will
Bill Morneau, did you ask me that just to buy yourself some additional time? Huh? What? Will Bill Morneau be finance minister 12 months from now?
No.
No. Why not?
I don't think so. People are really pretty upset about this situation. He's done it's not because he hasn't done an okay job, but again, brought in by a rookie prime minister. He's a rookie. This was a big misstep, and it's coming from an entitled rich family. The whole thing is the optics are pretty lousy, and I think it reflects on the prime minister. Now, I'd have to say, well, good for the CEO, the prime minister, and standing by his guy, but I think they'll find another better position for him a year from now.
Amanda, last year, I asked you if Kevin O'Leary would become the next leader of the Conservative Party of Canada.
And I said I didn't even think he would run because he doesn't speak French. And the next day he called me to say, Lang, I'm going to run. And I said, you jerk. Call me yesterday.
And you were right. He did not become. He did. Well, when I asked you, will he become the Conservative Party, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, you said, and I quote, hell no, was the actual quote. And you were right on that front. What does Scheer need to articulate from a policy standpoint on jobs, on the economy, in the world that you cover? What are the things that he needs to do or say?
I mean, my view is on Scheer is that he actually needs to show his personality a little, his genuine personality a little more. And anybody who
you don't think the little plaid shirt was an expression of his genuine personality?
I think he's being sort of styled as this everyman Canadian. And it doesn't really work. And the truth is, if you remember him as Speaker, he's smart as hell. He knows his stuff. He's not afraid to stand up for himself and what he thinks. He can be very funny. I just think that personality needs to emerge. And I'll say again, I've said it before, but one of the things I feel really blessed by in this country is that when we look at the field of candidates that we have to choose from, there's nobody outlandish out there. Prime Minister Scheer will not unseat anything important to anybody's values or beliefs any more than a Prime Minister Trudeau does. We get this wonderful kind of big tent with all these great people. I think he may hit Trudeau at the right moment, but I suspect it's another election cycle away from anything like that. He's got everything he needs. He's just being put in Mark's Work Wearhouse clothes and styled wrong.
Claudia, you had a point.
I just wanted to say that Mr. Scheer is going to be sharing the spotlight a lot with Jason Kenney, because I think that a lot of the counterpoints are going to come from Kenney on big policy issues like climate change, like regulatory reform, like transfer payments. He's going to be the strong Conservative voice, I think, in the country.
And as you predicted, he became the leader of the Conservative Party. The Wild Rose and the PC, the traditional PC party, came together as you predicted, both as expected, but also part of the mix. Andrew, give us your sense for how these three leaders are going to do the dance.
Well, I think Trudeau's, first of all, we should say, we don't tend to remove governments after only one term in this country, and we certainly don't do so when the economy is doing well. So you would, on those sort of broad grounds, you would say it's unlikely that the Liberals would be in any trouble. That being said, they've invested so heavily in the personality of one man, and he's shown himself to be vulnerable. He makes big mistakes, and he's particularly, I think, vulnerable, and this isn't fair or right, but it's politics is, he's vulnerable on the kind of entitled rich kid thing. The whole we're for the middle class, this monotonous, everything's for the middle class, was designed as kind of a shield on that score, because they knew the kind of princeling thing could work against him. And this is why I do think the tax thing and the aftermath of it was so damaging to them, because it allowed the opposition to start talking about your numbered companies and your holdings of this and your holdings of that. It's extraordinary that the Liberals couldn't see that that would be the possible response to it. And I think Bill Morneau is a constant reminder of that, so I suspect he may be gone in a year. But I think that we've just seen some chips in Trudeau's armor, and when you've invested so much, as I say, in the personality of one person, people fall out of love as easily as they fall into love. I remember this happened to David Peterson. When David Peterson first came in as Premier, he had sort of tousled hair and he wore a red tie every day. It was his signature red tie, and everybody thought, oh, wasn't that charming? And then there was a day, late in his term when it was like he came down for breakfast and everyone said, again with the red tie. Right? And it was just like, it's over. And I think if the Liberals are not careful, that's the risk, is people could decide, I'm sick of those things I thought were charming before.
JF, looking at the provincial dynamic, one of the things that changed in early 18 was the labor laws. A bunch of things, including minimum wage. There has been a lot of heat on Kathleen Wynne versus Tim Hortons and certain franchisees there. I'm not going to ask your prediction about Tim Hortons, but I am going to ask you your prediction for the true economic impact of the minimum wage hikes. What do you think is going to unfold there?
Well, this is another one of these tricky things where, on the face of it, an government intrusion like a minimum wage, by our training suggests, and, business people will tend to say the same thing, is a negative shock. It's a negative labor supply shock. So it makes things more difficult for business. It raises the cost of business, obviously. It's got a whole range of implications in terms of how it affects the marketplace. Again, the reality, and there's an analogy here to the corporate tax stuff, fortunately or not, which is, there have been a lot of experiments with minimum wages across the world, and in fact in Canada and the U.S. as well. And the overwhelming evidence of that is that minimum wages tend to not have the dire economic consequences that people anticipate them to have. Now, there's a big caveat here, which is minimum wage increases tend to not be as dramatic as they are in Ontario, and that's a big, it's a major change, right? It's 22% increase in labor costs for minimum wage earners, just like that. So we do anticipate a bit of negative impact, but nothing that would kind of be in line with your kind of rational priors of, my God, my labor costs are going up 20%, this is the end of the world. The evidence just doesn't support that to a full extent. That being said, we're also in a world where labor markets are extremely frothy. Right, the Ontario economy, the Canadian economy going into 2018 is doing extremely well, and we're at a point in the cycle where there are labor shortages. Wages are up 3% year on year. This is not, if you will, the right time. In addition to kind of the magnitude of the increase, it's not really the right time to put these measures into place because you're only making a challenging labor situation even more challenging by virtue of the fact that you're forcing the cost of labor up to the extent that you are. That being said, we're not terribly worried about the overall impact.
Andrew, question from the floor from you. Will the Liberals win the 2018 Ontario provincial election?
I don't know.
That's good.
It's my answer to most questions. If you'd asked that question 6 months or a year ago, I might have had a more definitive answer. It certainly looked pretty baked in at that point, particularly over the hydro price increases. Since then, she has thrown absolutely everything but the kitchen sink at the electorate, whether it's rent controls or tuition subsidies or pharmacare for young people or the minimum wage increase. And you can bet they've all been focus group tested and polled through the roof. And the Conservatives have a history of finding ways to beat themselves. Patrick Brown is not a particularly inspiring Conservative leader. There are divisions within his party on issues like the carbon tax, for example. And those things tend to become exposed in the heat of election campaigns. So, you'd think the Liberals had earned their way into the opposition long ago, but I just can't bring myself to say that it's likely that I can predict that they'll lose. There's definitely a strong chance they will lose, but the Conservatives just seem to find ways to lose.
Amanda, this is a financial outlook, so I'd be remiss in not asking you to talk a little bit about the stock market. Where do you predict the market's going to be? Hovering around 16,000 points. It's up over where it was at this point a year ago? Up, down, in between?
Yes.
Yeah. Use that hell no phrase again. I like that a lot. Or what, said another way, what are some conditions that you are watching that will, you believe will
I am
inform...
willing to predict with 100% certainty that there will be a market correction at some point in the future.
You know, I can edit out those last two parts of your answer.
Because the laws of thermodynamics or whatever they are haven't changed.
But we're 10 years into a bull run.
Things do not only go up. It's long in the tooth. There's some really crazy add-ons here. I mean, the terrible, gut-wrenching tax law that was just imposed in America, I have to say, it still makes me feel sick, that tax bill, is good for stock markets. It's good for corporate profits. It's good for some investors. In the short term, there will be big write-offs for tax deferrals sitting on the balance sheet, but it's going to be good for the market. So that's a bit of an unknown. The stimulus effect that'll have on the economy creates an unknown. But there's, by some measures, and you can slice and dice the metrics to defend market valuations, but by many, many measures, this is an overvalued market. And there are parts of it that are clearly in frothy territory. I speak of cryptocurrencies here, among other things. So that it will correct is inevitable. Will it be a huge dislocation that hurts beyond, a 7 to 10%? I don't know.
We're moving into the speed round, the last 5 minutes of our conversation, and the first question to you, is to you, JF. What will interest rates look like a year from now? I know there's lots of talk about what's going to happen in the next couple of weeks, but if you predict a year from now, is it none? Is it 1? Is it 2? Is it 3?
So you mean Bank of Canada rates?
Yes.
75 basis points higher.
75 basis points higher. Said with some conviction. All right, well, while you're on that roll, what is the number one variable you're watching out for, the number one risk factor that could affect economic performance in Canada in 2018?
The evolution of the NAFTA talks.
The evolution of the NAFTA talks. Amanda Lang, what do you make of Bitcoin? Flash in the pan or the next internet?
No, I think it's the next internet stock in 1999. I think it's an overvalued flash in the pan with some really seriously important underlying technology, but as an investment in itself, zero fundamentals.
Claudia, oil, 12 months out. Last year, the panel was pretty unified in terms of where oil would be in 2017. It was in the $50 to $60 range-ish. What is the prediction on where oil will be a year from now based on the people that you talked to?
Oh, gosh. Outlooks are all over the map. Some people see a spike. Some people see another crash. I'm in the camp that we're likely going to see oil prices increase from here globally. And the main reason for that, I think, is because nobody wants another oil crash. Not OPEC, not U.S. producers, not Russia. However, that doesn't mean that Canadian oil and gas will benefit from that. Because we still have a transportation problem. So the Canadian industry is still behaving as if a crash could be just around the corner. So that disconnect, I think, will continue.
I'm going to ask each of the panelists for their last word in just a moment. That could be a hope, it could be a prediction, it could be a topic that we haven't yet covered in our remarks. But before I do that, JF, I want to turn to you and ask you about the Toronto real estate market. So we've had some recent data on sales there from your perch as an economist. What do you predict that market will look like locally in a year?
I think probably an extension of what we've been seeing right now, which is a market that's reasonably healthy with reasonably muted house price increases. What we saw earlier this year was clearly unsustainable. There's no surprise that that's changed. Policy intervention, I think, had its desired impact, even though it wasn't necessarily the best kind of set of policy interventions. But the fundamentals remain very, very strong. So we've got a strong domestic economy. Interest rates remain low. Even though we think they're going to go up 75 basis points, it's still reasonably slow. Labor income is rising quickly. Immigration is strong. Population flows are favorable to housing across the country, in particular Toronto and Vancouver. So we don't anticipate any kind of major upheavals in the market between now and this time next year.
Hash brownie.
Yes, Brownie, look at that. Our new laid back, you're from BC practically.
That's right.
Diane, I'm going to start with you on the last word. So a minute to provide a hope, a prediction, or a topic that we haven't addressed in our time so far.
Well, I think the NAFTA thing will work out, and Canada will be just fine because of our close relationship with the United States economically, the fact that we're merging constantly and integrating even more. the cross-border ownership relationships. The people that he has on the trading side, on the U.S. side, are very familiar with Canada. Sometimes that's a bad thing, but I think in this case it's a good thing. So that really is an important underpinning. On the real estate thing, I have very, very big concerns about what's happened to the real estate in the last 5 years. We are a major target for money launderers all over the world, and I don't see why that will stop.
Claudia, last word to you. I know you're like, wow, he just jumped all over the place. And
yeah,
here
I know. So, well, I'm going to be the idealist. I think my hope is that this is the year that First Nations become full participants in the Canadian economy, and I think we're going to see them become supportive of projects as opposed to opponents.
JF.
My hope is that this time next year we will realize that Trump was just as much a distraction this year as he was last year. in the sense that he talks with a lot. His actions and consequences or speeches don't have much of an impact.
Andrew.
I guess to maybe go back to something I said last year, my hope is that we don't find ourselves with the United States in a constitutional crisis over the Mueller investigation. At some point, Trump is going to have to decide which is the bigger threat to him, allowing Mueller to close in on him as relentlessly as he seems to be doing, and all the consequences that flow from that, or firing him, or whatever else he might do to try and block the investigation, pardoning various people, etc. Which, if he does, it's been remarkable to see how far some of the Republicans have been willing to bend over to accommodate him. But surely there's got to be some kind of line that even a dyed-in-the-wool Republican will not follow on. And blocking the process of justice in that regard is so overt and such a challenge to the rule of law that it's hard to believe people could countenance it. I mean, what did Nixon in the end was the stuff that Trump has talked about openly. That's how far our standards have fallen already, or the standards the States has, and I just hope that doesn't go as far as I fear it might.
Amanda.
I have a hope, and that is that we have a serious, national, courageous conversation about pipelines in this country, what we're going to do, and a strategy, and how that meets up with our goals on climate change. I feel like we're not having it. It's not grown up enough, and it's not fast enough. And my prediction is that in the hashtag MeToo realm, at least one high-profile woman will be nabbed for abusing her power against men. Not me.
That was not a preemptive confession. No.
I will round this out from a tweet from Donald Trump at 12:57 while our conversation unfolded. It reads, quote, "I'll beat Oprah." Yeah, that's what he said. So to our panelists, thank you very much for yet again an exciting and insightful conversation. 2017. Jillian, back to you. And we'll just stay here.
Wow, that certainly didn't disappoint. I just want to take a few quick minutes to thank the panelists and Bruce for a wonderful session. It was thought-provoking. It was insightful. And an observation from being here for the past few years, I would observe that there was the least number of very forceful predictions today, which tells you that we live in very interesting times, and who knows what will be here next year, but I hope all of you will be here to hear our panel yet again, because this is a delightful day and we really all get a lot out of it. So, Bruce, you are also an extraordinary Q&A master, and you do it so well, so we appreciate all the effort and work that you put into this as well. So thank you. I would just like to say a final thank you to our sponsors, to E&Y, to Scotiabank, and of course to the National Post. Thank you very much. To learn more about the club or upcoming events, please visit us at canadianclub.org. Thank you for joining us, and we really hope to see you all again soon. Have a wonderful afternoon.